Hey guys, today we're going to be going over switches in the EV3 Mondstorm software. So basically what a switch is it's kind of like a yes or no question. So go on over and navigate to the orange section of the block, which is flow control, and then the second to right block is a switch. So go ahead and drag that on out. So here's what a switch block looks like. Over here you have a parameter. In this case it's already set to touch sensor, compare, and state. And then we have a checkbox, and then we have an Xbox. So basically, what this means is that if a certain condition is fulfilled, it'll run whatever blocks are in the spot, essentially. And if it's not fulfilled, if that condition is not fulfilled, it'll run whatever's in this X spot. So in this case scenario, that means that if the touch sensor is pressed, which is 1, it'll run whatever's in here. Whereas if the touch sensor is not pressed, it'll run whatever's in here. So this is really helpful if there are two different outcomes. And you can also use this for a color sensor, for touch sensor, for literally anything. So in that sense, it's super helpful. One really important thing to remember about a switch is that it always has to be within a loop. So go ahead and drag that loop on there. And the reason for this is that if you only have one switch, it'll only do the thing one time. Whereas if you have a loop, and make sure this loop is always set to unlimited. So it'll just do it in a limited amount of times. The program's never going to end. So even if you tried to run a switch without a loop, if you just tried to run it like this and then took the loop away, it wouldn't even execute. The program wouldn't work. So make sure to always have a loop. And then have a switch within that loop if you want to run it. Alright. So for our first program, what we're going to want to do is we're going to say if the touch sensor is pressed, then display a happy face. If it's not pressed, display a sad face. So the way you display certain emoticons and stuff on your EV3 display is by going over to this block over here, the third from right that says display, and just go ahead and drag it on out. So as you can see, you have a little file icon, that's for images, but you can also display text, shapes, and images. For now, we're just going to stick with that. And then go over here. Right now it says neutral, but click on this. Go over to Lego image files. Scroll on down, go to expressions, and then click on big smile. So there we go. And then now we're going to want to display a sad face. So do the same thing. Go to neutral, Lego image files, expressions, and select sad. There we go. So basically, what do you guys think this program is going to do? So as I said before, since the switch is set to touch sensor compare state, this means that if the touch sensor is pressed, the EV3 brick will display a big smile, whereas if the touch sensor is not pressed, it'll display a sad face, and this will just keep on going because it's in a loop. So go ahead and try to run that program on your own. And as I mentioned before, the cool thing about having a switch is that you can use it with all different types of things. You can use it with a color sensor. For now, why don't we try using it with brick buttons? So go on over here to brick buttons. We always use compare, and just select brick buttons right over there. So as you can see, it's showing a little brick button here, the second one, which is the brick button in the middle, and 1 is always going to be pressed. So just set it like that. And basically what this means that if the center button is pressed, it'll display a big smile. If it's not pressed, it'll display a sad face. So try and run that program on your own. So switches are really helpful in the sense that you can use it with all different types of things. So for our next program, we're actually going to be using with a color sensor. Alright, so here's your guys' challenge. What I want you to do is to, using loops and switches, go forward until you see a black line. When you see the black line, turn backwards and do a 180-degree turn. Or rather, stop, go backward, and do a 180-degree turn. So try that program on your own, and if you don't understand, I'll show you guys what the solution is. Alright, so here's the solution to the program. So I'll go through it step by step. So right over here, you can already see that we have a loop and a switch. That's always going to happen regardless. And here we have our X condition, and then we have our check condition. And then right over here, the parameter is set to color sensor, compare, and reflected light intensity, which I mentioned we should always use reflected light intensity or color, depending on what you like. And this value will change depending on what your color sensor reads, and make sure to always go in port view to determine that. For me, it's around about 7. So basically, I'm saying that if the touch sensor gives us a value that's less than 7, it'll execute whatever's in this part, in the checkbox. So why don't we go over that? So we said if the color sensor value is less than 7, which means it's a dark color, because dark colors don't reflect as much, the robot will stop, move backward for 1 rotation, and then take an 180-degree turn. So that's good. And if the color sensor does not return a value that is less than 7, meaning that it's probably on a lighter color, or like a white table or something like that, in that case, it just goes forward for 50 power. So that's your program, and make sure this loop setting is always on unlimited. Do not change this one. The value that the parameter that you want to change is this one. Alright, and as always, if you wanted to, currently it's on color sensor, compare, reflected light intensity. You can always change that to color and say black, meaning that if the color sensor sees a black value, or if it sees a black line, it'll do this. If it sees any other color, it'll do this. But typically reflected light intensity is more accurate. You can also use this with a touch sensor. So if you go on over here, touch sensor, compare, and state, you can see that we changed the value to touch sensor. So what do you guys think this program is going to do? Right, so it'll do the exact same thing as the color sensor. If the touch sensor is pressed, it'll stop, go backward, and turn around. If it's not pressed, it'll just continue going forward. So that kind of shows the versatility of the loop and switch construct. And by the way, whenever you have a loop and a switch, or when you have a switch inside a loop, that is called a Boolean expression. Just something to know. Alright. So I'm going to have one more challenge for you guys, and this one is going to get a bit complicated. But basically, I want you guys to have a program so that when the robot moves forward, or basically just build off of this program, and then in your X condition, instead of just having it as move forward, make another switch with a touch sensor in it, and say that if the touch sensor is pressed, then move the arm up and down, whereas if it's not pressed, just move the robot forward. So why don't you guys go ahead and try that, and I'll show you guys a solution if you're stuck. Alright, so here's the solution to the program. Let me change this. So, as I mentioned before, it's basically the same program as last time, but there's another additional switch. This time it's using the touch sensor. So what this is saying is, in this little section over here, it's saying that if the touch sensor is pressed, I mentioned that we want to move the arm down and up. Whereas if it's not pressed, which is probably not going to happen, or which is most likely going to happen, then the robot just moves forward. It doesn't do anything. So only if the touch sensor is pressed does it move down and up. So this can be really helpful in, for instance, a sumo wrestling competition or a sumo bot competition, if you want to try to knock your opponent over or something. And this part is also very useful in a sumo wrestling competition, because when you see the black line, when the robot identifies a black line, it has to stop and move backward and turn around, or else it'll just simply move over and you're not going to be able to win the competition. So yeah, that's about it for loops and swishes, and I'll see you guys in the next lesson.